So before we talk true crime today, I want to gracias a mi patrocinador Babbel. Yeah, don't switch your subtitles on. Nothing has gone wrong. This is me thanking Babbel for sponsoring this video. So I currently have a language goal. I used to live in France, so I really want to revisit and refresh my language memory. But I'm also desperate to learn Spanish. My whole family want to learn it. So my hubby and my kids are learning Spanish and we're doing it through Babbel. So if, like me, languages were definitely not your thing at school, my French teacher literally burst out laughing at me during my French oral exam. That is a true story. Then I promise you Babbel is going to transform how you feel about speaking a new language. So Babbel helps you focus on real life vocab, so it means that you get to speak as fast as possible. There are 14 languages that Babbel specialise in, including things like Polish and Italian. There's just loads to choose from. As I am dyslexic, I genuinely find learning a little bit more challenging, but I have genuinely been absolutely loving the way that Babbel brings learning to life. The way that it teaches you grammar and vocab is fun, and the way you can listen to how words and statements are meant to be pronounced and have a go yourself makes it really easy. And then you have these really short tests and memory reviews, and they help to embed that learning into your memory. And if you want to learn with others, you can even sign up for online tutoring classes with literally world-class teachers. And I think what's clear about this particular app is you can tell it's been created by experts. It's not just some kind of algorithm that makes learning feel really impersonal. Babbel for me has got a really kinesthetic approach to learning. So you can learn through podcasts, through games, through videos, which really helps to break up the intensity. It makes the journey feel fun. And if you're like me and a bit short of time, then the great thing about Babbel is you can do the lessons in 10 minutes, which I love because it means that I know that I can set myself goals daily. I think that's probably what has surprised me more than anything. I genuinely thought I was useless at languages, but I realise now it was never me. I'm not the problem, it was the way I was being taught. The speed that I am picking up Spanish is actually really surprising, and even more importantly, I am genuinely enjoying the process. The app is absolutely brilliant, so simple to use, absolutely packed with so much expert teaching that if I'm honest, it feels like you've got a personal language tutor in your pocket. Babbel is giving me an awesome offer to share with you. So currently, if you sign up, you'll get 30% off either a 6, 12 month or lifetime membership. So that means you can start learning a language straight away. It's an absolute bargain. And who knows, in a year, I may even be doing the occasional true crime video in Spanish or French. Sigamos con el video de hoy. That means let's get on with today's video, basically. Welcome to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thank you so much for joining me, my lovelies. If you are new to this channel, I release crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously. My catchphrase is crime and consistency. Actually, I've got quite a few catchphrases, if I'm honest. Stick with me, you'll find them out. I'm wearing one now, bang to rights, my merch is out. So feel free to follow the link if you fancy some. Also, you guys asked me for this like 100 times, and it was one of the cases that I genuinely didn't know whether I was going to do. And that's just because the crossover of the mother in this case, she has been in places like this morning when I've been there. I also know people who know her, and she's an amazing woman, and I don't want to bring any pain. Like, I don't want to bring pain to anybody that I cover in these cases. You know, there are families involved in all of them, but sometimes it just feels really personal because there's been those kind of momentary interactions and visuals that make it feel like you have more of a personal connection with it. But nonetheless, after considering this for a long time, I thought, you know what, I am going to cover the case of James Bulger because I think it's one of those that changed a nation's perception, full stop. It changed the way that we view young people, let's be honest. And the ramifications of the loss of that gorgeous little toddler is still today playing out. So I've decided to do this in spite of those initial reservations. I really hope that I do it the justice it deserves. I really hope that I do James Bulger the justice that he deserves in telling his story in an accurate way. Now, not that I believe for 1 minute you will not have heard of this case. I still think that it's going to be important to present this in a way that you would never have known that this occurred. Because even though it's a widespread case, the assumptions that I could make about your knowledge on it will probably be incorrect. So stick with me in the fact that I am going to go through this in as much detail as possible. Also, just to note, for anybody who has looked at Robert Thompson and Jon Venables, which are the two killers in this case, some people have placed their identities on websites where you can literally go and look at who they are, even though they've been granted anonymity. And I just want to give a shout out to you to remind you not to look at those, not to go on those sites, not to share those sites, because you can be legally culpable. You might not think that's fair, but you can be. So it's just a warning, really. People don't realise that if you share pictures of people whose identities have been changed, you are committing an illegal offence. I don't want anybody to get into trouble, no matter how angered you feel or how unjust that you feel some of those issues are, such as should killers ever be granted new identities? It's a moral question. Some people come down on the side of yes, they should, and some people come down on the side that no, they had an action, there was a consequence, and it's important to acknowledge the consequences, take responsibility for the crime. But again, just to bring that back into vision, in this moment in time, we are dealing with very young children when this crime occurred, which makes it, to some degree, even more terrifying. I always think whether it's something in the DNA of cold-blooded killers that means that they become murderers, or whether they're created by life experiences. It's a debate that I have in my head. It's a debate that we have in the world of therapeutic intervention. It's certainly the debate that we have in true crime. And I think this fierce debate is one of those things that plays out because we can't prove either. You know, there's this whole nature-nurture debate. Is somebody born? Are they created? Is it a mix of both? And whatever the answer, when we actually consider the question, we tend to imagine looking at an adult, looking at an adult that represents something malevolent, looking into the eyes of somebody like Richard Ramirez, for example, the darkness that you see in their eyes. And when we're thinking of those individuals, those monsters in the making, we don't imagine a child at any point. We don't consider children to have the capacity to carry out unimaginably terrifying crimes. But in the case of a 1993 killing that literally shocked the nation, it shocked the world. 2 children, and to be specific, 2 10-year-old children from Liverpool. They were the eyes that we were looking into. They were the eyes of 2 children who had carried out unspeakable acts on a little boy. In February 1993, literally everyone in the UK would be familiar with the names Jon Venables and Robert Thompson. They were primary school children, and they were primary school children who had committed a murder so shocking that today, even today, their names still cause utter revulsion. It's almost 30 years later, and yet still, the mention of their names provokes a really, really severe reaction in anybody of any age back in the day who remembers this case. So let's look at these 2 young killers. Robert Thompson was born on the 23rd of August 1982. He was born in Liverpool, and he was the 5th of 7 children. His father actually abandoned the family very early on, and this abandonment had a huge impact on Thompson's mother, Anne. In fact, people said that it's this point in her life where she begins to just spiral into a depression. She turns to alcohol. She even attempts to take her own life with an overdose. So this is not a great environment for a child to be growing up in. 7 children, you can understand the stresses and strains that would cause, and to be a lone parent, dealing with the economic issues of that, dealing with the attentional issues required, and then dealing with your own feelings of grief because your partner has left you. That's going to be challenging, let alone then turning to alcohol and also self-medicating your depression in that way. A household inviting those kind of issues means a household of chaos. Also, Thompson was a child who was basically very used to violence during his childhood. It seems like his older siblings in particular were violent towards him. And from the age of around 8 years, he used to just spend most of his time on the streets with his friends. And he got into crime really early. He was causing trouble, just public disorder, petty crime. And when he was described later down the line, he was actually described as an urban feral child and a career delinquent. So a child that somehow from a very early age got engaged in all these non-pro-social behaviours. As I mentioned, he came from a family of 7 brothers. That's a lot of male energy, isn't it? And you can imagine in these circumstances that I'm talking about now, and I know that there'll be lots of people out there who come from big families who had a relatively chaotic but brilliant upbringing and is so thankful for the size of the family. But if there is a level of dysfunction in a family of males this way, and there isn't a primary caregiver who is a male role model, and they are living in an environment that is less than perfect, you can imagine that it's not going to be that easy being one of the children in there. And Thompson's apparently very brutally picked on by his older siblings, and one of the main reasons for that is that he sucked his thumb. So they pinpointed this problem that they perceived he had, and then they were really aggressive towards him. Lots of children as well soothe themselves with thumb sucking. It interests me the reaction that society has when you see a child thumb sucking. People will say you'll damage your teeth, or people will say that you're being childish, but no one's thinking about, well, what is the child using that thumb sucking behaviour for? My sister was a thumb sucker, and still today, if she's in very stressful times, you will catch her doing it. It is a self-soothing mechanism. So he's probably dealing with some emotional collateral anyway, which is why he's using that as a coping strategy. And then he's getting beaten for it. It's also really important that I bring into the frame that at this point, and at the point where Thompson was brought in because he committed this heinous crime we're going to explore today, prior to that, there was no record of violence with him. But I will say that detectives said that when they interviewed him and when they kind of got to know the boy, they thought he was just streetwise beyond his years. I've worked in some communities where I've literally had time with 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds, and they're smoking cigarettes and they're swearing and they're talking about highly inappropriate things. And you know that on an emotional maturity level, they are still a little boy, a little girl. But on a physical activity level, they're doing things that young adults are doing and adults are doing, and you know that it's completely dysfunctional. It seems like Thompson fitted that category. Now, like Thompson, Jon Venables was also born in Liverpool. He was born on the 13th of August 1982. Again, another similar context between the two. His parents were also separated. But it's worth noting that Venables' father, although he was separated from his mum, was still involved in his life. So Venables spent Sunday to Thursday with his mum, and then he spent the rest of the week with his dad. So a relatively engaged relationship. One of the things that does stand out, however, is that even though he had both parents involved in his life, people reported that Susan, Venables' mother, was somebody who treated him very harshly, and he was scared of her. She was also somebody who had a reputation in the local community for being highly promiscuous, although this was probably exaggerated in the press. And also, no woman should feel guilty, no man should feel guilty for sexual liaisons as long as the parties are both consenting and happy about the situation. That noted, if you have a parent who is spending a lot of time away having liaisons, their eye may not be on the ball to the degree it should be as a parent. We can throw that in as a possibility. Venables' behaviour at school was certainly something that stood out. It gave his teachers real room for concern. And some of his behaviours were not in context with what we would expect to see as far as a typical or well-adjusted child is concerned. So he would rock and he would moan, he would bang his head on the desk, and he would also hang from a coat peg like a bat. I note that whilst they can seem very destructive and very strange, we also see rocking behaviours as a self-soothing mechanism. We see banging behaviours. So even though you can't imagine why anybody would want to bang their head to soothe themselves, we see it. It happens. When children are struggling, for whatever reason, this type of behaviour is contextual to those struggles, and it acts as a mechanism of supporting the way that they feel emotionally, dealing with those difficult emotions. So he's exhibiting these signs. Also noted as highly hyperactive, which is like the worst thing for any teacher to have to deal with. At the end of the day, our education system is not geared up to kids with lots of energy who maybe have dysfunction in their life and aren't in a position or a state to be able to just sit down and work. It's not that there's anything broken about that child's actions. Lots of kids don't find it easy to fit into the system that we have currently. But if you are a teacher of that child and they won't concentrate and they're making noise and they're refusing to do their work or they're getting out of the chair, you can imagine that there's going to be a lot of negativity that child experiences. Also, he had been known to be violent. So Venables had got a history where people looked at him and said, well, actually, this child did have some pretty critical issues in his behaviour. And on one occasion, he even throttled another pupil at his school. So he wasn't afraid to engage in that kind of behaviour. Both of the boys went to the same primary school and they were good friends, but not initially. So when they first had contact with one another, Thompson actually started picking on Venables. So he identified Venables as somebody potentially more vulnerable than him, and he used that and was powerful over Venables. But this changed because they end up both getting kept back a year in the same class. So their problems academically, their problems at school per se, had led to teachers believing that they required that extra year. So they get held back in the same class. That means that they have familiarity, they're the same age as one another. Those connections bring them closer together and they become friends. Even though they are really young kids, one of the things that they get a reputation for is playing truant together. Now, I think if you look back at your primary education, some of you may well have truanted in your primary education. I did in my secondary education consistently. It was something it's very effective at. It's also why I have a lot of knowledge about black and white films, pretty much any films from the 40s up to the 70s, because that's what used to play in the day when I was truanting. I also got quite good at playing pool, but not when I was at primary school. Primary school is a place where, on the whole, even children with problems can engage in most of the curriculum. It tends to feel like quite a safe place. You tend to get fed if you come from a place where you wouldn't ordinarily have access to good food, because there are those kind of opportunities, there are those kind of things that the government create and programs that the government create so that you can at least enjoy a hot meal. So to be avoiding going to school before you get into secondary school demonstrates some really ingrained issues and obviously sets in store big problems per se in your education, because you are genuinely missing out on those foundations. So they also get this considered reputation as troublemakers. So people look at their behaviour, consider how distinct it is from other children's, and assign them that title, that they're just troublemakers who get involved in criminality. And even though this is low-level criminal activity, because of their age, it is still very unusual. They go around local shops and shoplift. Also, they kind of got up to mischievous pranks that when you think about it on one level, you can understand why a child may find it funny. But actually, if you are the recipient of the behaviour, it could seem very sinister. So they would choose to jump out and scare old ladies on the street. And like I said, Getting a reaction out of somebody for fun is something a lot of us will have done. Like, for example, I am the kind of person who does at times hide behind doors in my home and jump out. I do have quite a lot of videos of me doing that. But then my family, they know that I'm safe, I'm not going to harm them, they're not afraid of me. So it's funny as opposed to fear-inducing. If you're just like walking down the street and you're elderly and then these young kids scare you, that's really quite abusive and hostile. And it also shows that the kids are not thinking about the impact of the feelings that they are provoking in another human being. Yes, they're thinking it's funny. Yes, they know it's probably not acceptable behaviour, but they haven't got the conscious understanding emotionally of the damage that they could be causing that old lady. Again, poor consequential thinking and some malice in that behaviour. 12th of February 1993, again, on this day, Venables and Thompson have skipped school. And they spend the time at New Strand Shopping Centre, which is in Bootle. They've gone there to shoplift. And the shoplifting that they get engaged in involves taking various items. So these include sweets, they take batteries, they take a troll doll. I don't know whether any of you know what a troll doll is. I know what a troll doll is. My sister used to collect them. I thought they were weird and ugly with strange hair, but nonetheless, they were quite popular. Then again, so were Cabbage Patch dolls, and they should never have been released. They're a blight on toy history, in my opinion. Nothing was acceptable about Cabbage Patch dolls. I digress. Anyway, on top of that, they'd taken a can of blue modelling paint. So kind of a mixed bag as far as shoplifting is concerned. One can argue, well, maybe they were just stealing things because they could get their hands on it easily. They got away with taking those things. Or it could be, is there some premeditation about what they are going to do that day? We're never going to fully know, are we? We're never going to fully know what their intentions were when they went to that shopping centre in Bootle. We don't know whether they were shoplifting with purpose or just doing it because that's what they did, that's how they passed the time. But what we do know is that some officers who were involved in this case said that they were absolutely convinced, on having interviewed the boys and having followed the case, being involved with the case, they genuinely believed that those two boys were that day absolutely planning to kill a child. And when I've looked at the conduct that day, I genuinely believe that that belief system of the police supports this contention. I genuinely do. Because I've looked at their movements, I've looked at what they shoplifted, I've looked at what they did with the items, and I cannot help but gravitate myself towards the idea that there was something going on in those boys' minds where they had planned to execute this kind of detail, to find a child and to harm them. When the police questioned one of the boys, he actually later claimed that the original plan had been to take a child and then to push that child into oncoming traffic. So outside the shopping centre, it was very, very busy. So he said that initially they anticipated that they would get a child, take them outside, and then literally push them into that traffic, which in itself is absolutely beyond reason and beyond terrifying. But it shows the end result of what we're going to talk about today regarding the heinous murder versus the initial desire to kill a child. We're still in the same space, aren't we? That they wanted to do damage to an innocent little boy or girl. Because CCTV was available at the time, what we see is that they were captured on CCTV, loitering basically in the shopping centre. And that loitering seems very much to be around the fact that they were trying to pick out a potential victim. They were selecting a child, and they actually unsuccessfully managed to abduct a 3-year-old girl and her 2-year-old brother from outside TJ Hughes. Now, thank God for that mother. She noticed. She ran out. She scooped up a son who'd actually already began to wander off with them. So they had tried literally to take those children. Imagine how that mother must have felt when she found out what actually happened to this poor child that we're going to talk about today. Because those boys had a full intention, and that full intention was to carry out whatever plan they had in their head involving a child or children that day. And if it hadn't been for the stroke of luck that that mother had just noticed, we could be talking about a different child or children than we are. And it's just horrifying to even begin to express to you that when I was doing this research, all I could think throughout it was, how did this happen? How did this beautiful little boy end up in this situation? And the reason I'm going to say that is I've known this case. I read the inquiry many, many years ago. I was very interested to see what had occurred because I don't like reading the newspapers. I find it's usually extreme, the way that they report. It's not always factual. Often it paints people as villains, including parents, for example, who are completely innocent just to sell papers. So I read the inquiry and it took my breath away when I was learning about what had gone on. But going through these facts and details again, there are certain things in this case that I think are so frustrating. So frustrating. There were so many missed opportunities when it comes down to this child potentially having been protected, which I'm going to talk about today. But it is heartbreaking to imagine that those two boys who clearly stand out because they should be in school are in a shopping centre which clearly has CCTV and security, and they're also shoplifting. And for whatever reason, nobody's really paying that attention. And then they actually try to abduct other children, get caught doing that. And again, nothing necessarily happens at that point, even though this behaviour is deeply disturbing. So we get to around 3:40 p.m. It's at this point that Venables and Thompson notice Denise Bulger. So Denise Bulger is beautiful, James Bulger's mum. She's at A.R. Tim's Butchers. That's the shop on a lower level of the shopping centre. She's a 2-year-old son, James. And even though he's recorded as being 2, it was literally just a few days before his 3rd birthday. At this point, James was the only child of Denise and her husband, Ralph. They had had a daughter, in fact, but she'd been stillborn. For me, to imagine the absolute agony of going through the loss of a baby in that way, when you're expectant and you're ready to have a child, and then suddenly you give birth to that child and you do not get to be that mother. When you have your rainbow baby and you are given that chance of being the mother that you were so hopeful of being prior to it being ripped away from you, you can only imagine that you invest even more than the average parent, because they're everything, aren't they? This is your chance at being the mother you were denied prior to this. James was known as a really fun-loving, happy, curious little boy. He had sandy hair, blue eyes, he had a sparkling smile. He was known for loving Thomas the Tank Engine. My own eldest son, when he was little, had his whole room decorated in Thomas the Tank Engine. Totally relate to that. He was constantly playing on his trampoline, and the day that he was shopping with his mum had been a day of fun for him. They'd really enjoyed themselves. He'd just eaten some Smarties from Tesco. It was one of those lovely, ordinary days. Just a mum and a child, just shopping, going about their business. Denise had actually driven that morning with James, and she was with her sister-in-law, Nicola Bailey, from her home in Kirby. She'd gone to the New Strand shopping centre at Bootle, and it was literally the first time that James had been shopping with his mum without his buggy. First time. That butcher's shop that she went shopping at was going to be the last stop that she made before they returned home. Whilst Denise was getting served in the butcher's, all she did was she let go of her son's hand so that she could pay the butcher, so she could just pay for her shopping. So as Denise is paying, James is stood in the doorway, just stood in the doorway. And she ends up taking just a little bit longer to pay for the meat because the butcher had actually mixed her order up. That's all that she did. A completely normal interaction. Any mum, any dad out there, we've all done it. It's not that we're not keeping an eye on our child, it's just that in that moment we have to carry out an activity, a job, and then we're back on it. We're talking seconds. During this unbelievably short space of time, when her attention is just slightly diverted, Thompson and Venables struck. So they were loitering, they fixed onto James Bulger, they saw that moment, an opportunity, and they took it. Denise would later say, and it's so heartbreaking, I shouldn't have let go of his hand. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I shouldn't have let go. I hate the fact that she feels that guilt. How she can feel in any way like she did anything wrong, and yet she must carry that even though it's nothing to do with her. She was a fantastic and is a fantastic mother. She was in no way, shape or form to blame for what happened that day. You know, people out there, and there are people who are super judgmental per se. They really are. It's like they think that they would be perfect as a parent. But I'm a mum, I'm sure lots of you watching are mums or dads, and we all know you can't have your attention 100% on your child every single second of every single day. And the reason for that is we have other things to do, but most importantly, we trust the world around us on the whole for good reason. For good reason. It's very, very rare that a child is ever abducted, and it's almost unheard of that a child would be abducted by other children. You're in a busy shopping centre. You're just getting on with something you've done a million times before. Why would you not trust that environment? But that slight shift of attention that occurs, unfortunately, in this instance, invites a predator, or in this case, predators, into James Bulger's life. You know, the whole premise of a predator is they wait until the target is vulnerable, they're available, and then they just strike. It's just incredible to me that I'm talking about that almost sophisticated intent of predators, and yet we're talking about children in this case. We're talking about children. It's mind-blowing. So Thompson and Venables, they approach James in the doorway, and at this point they beckon him over. Now, anybody who's had children, even children who are a little bit anxious, they look at other kids and bigger kids and they're interested in them. They're excited by them. When you've got a nice life as a kid, you don't think that adults or children are harmful. You go about your business believing that the world is a safe place. So this gorgeous little boy, this innocent, unsuspecting James Bulger, just toddles off towards them. And then Venables takes him by the hand and then just quickly leaves the scene. They actually get CCTV of the pair just leading little James away from his mother through the upper level of the shopping centre, and that's about 3:42 p.m. At this point, Venables is seen holding his hand, and Thompson is a few feet ahead. It took less than 2 minutes before they had taken James and actually left the shopping centre. Unbelievable. Now, it doesn't take Denise 2 minutes to realise that her child is gone. You know, she realises pretty instantly where's James and starts looking for him. She's seen on CCTV running from the butcher. She's in panic. She's clearly absolutely beside herself, searching for James when she can't see him. She immediately gets in touch with the mall security. Announcements get made. They're broadcast to the whole shopping centre saying that people, can you see a child by themselves? Look, James is missing, letting the shoppers know that there is a lone child potentially wandering around. Or do you see a child matching the description? Because clearly that could potentially mean that a child is being led away by abductors. But even after half an hour of putting out those calls, of her searching desperately, James hasn't been found. At this point, they realise that something potentially more sinister has happened, or at least the fears are starting to grow. So the police are notified. At this point, Denise is asked to describe what James is wearing. She's able to do that: a blue anorak, grey sweatsuit, t-shirt with the word noddy printed on it, and a blue wool scarf with a white cat face. I can't even begin to imagine how Denise would have felt. It's so challenging, isn't it, to just place yourself in that position. I've covered cases like Cherish Periwinkle in the past. It's the same feeling. It's the impending sense of doom that these parents have to endure when they know that their little one has been taken. No one, when those announcements were being put out in the shopping centre, could have for 1 second anticipated that whilst those tannoy announcements were being made, a little boy was being led away to his death by 2 children. It was noted by witnesses that he was apparently crying for his mother as the boys dragged him, literally dragged him, from the shopping centre and up Stanley Road. So that little boy, just about to turn 3, is scared. He wants his mother. He doesn't want to go with these boys. He knows something is wrong. Thompson and Venables then take James a 1/4 mile. This is from the shopping centre. And they go to the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. Apparently at this point they start joking that they're going to push the toddler in the water. In fact, it's at this point that they inflict their first injury to James. Apparently they'd wanted him to kneel down to look in the water, and they'd hoped that when he did that, he'd fall in. Now, because he wouldn't do that, he wouldn't go over, because even though he's only coming up for 3, he clearly is afraid. They get really angry with him. And the response is that Thompson allegedly picked James up, threw him to the ground, and this instantly causes a really large bruise and cut to his forehead. So there must have been some real force there. Now, witnesses saw James, and they said that when they saw him, he was just crying his eyes out. And I know I'm going to come on to this later on, but I understand that some of you will be saying, what were these witnesses doing if they're seeing this little baby boy with 2 kids not old enough to be looking after him, and the child's screaming and crying and is injured? We'll talk about that a little bit later on. When James Bulger started screaming and crying initially, Thompson and Venables actually ran away because they felt that people might start coming over and it made them fearful. They had that very childish knee-jerk reaction to clear the scene. But then they stop. They turn back and they tell James to come to them, and heartbreakingly, that little beautiful boy just obediently follows. Of course. It's what children do, isn't it? Even the most savvy of young children have been tested in these ways, and when people go up to them and kind of tell them they need to go with them, very often, like I said, even the most streetwise of kids kind of feels obliged to follow. And we're talking about a very young toddler, and who else is he going to go around with? Who else is he going to walk with? He'd be completely on his own. Imagine the overwhelming feeling that would be in that little boy's body in that moment in time. Yes, he's injured. Yes, he's afraid. But who does he go to? So he just obediently follows. I cannot bear the fact that almost 40 people actually witnessed Thompson and Venables walking with James. Most said that they just presumed that they were just family members and therefore they didn't want to involve themselves. Those who did challenge the boys, and there were people who did challenge the boys, they managed to convince them that he was just a family member and that he wasn't a problem, that they were looking after him. Or they came up with this other ruse. They said that it was a little boy who was lost and they were taking him to a police station. I have to say, if I had gone up to some kids who had an injured child and they're like, he's lost, I'm going to take him to a police station, I'd be like, well, I'll take it from here, kids. I shall take it from here because you are not mature enough to take this child to the police station and this child is injured. But anyway, that doesn't happen. I don't know why, but it doesn't. Others who saw the kids with James were really concerned because They said that they could see that the boys were being very violent towards the toddler. In fact, according to some witnesses, and there were, as I said, 40 witnesses, they were violent towards him in plain sight. They were pushing him, they were shoving him, they were kicking him, they were punching him, they were dragging him down a road, and they could all tell that James was clearly distressed and crying. One witness even reported that they noticed that James Bulger was actually trying to dig his heels in as he was dragged to try to stop what was happening. And then one of the older boys, in return to that, then kicked him in the ribs under his right arm so that it kept him moving along. I don't get it. Honestly, I know I can't blame the witnesses. They were not the ones who carried out this heinous crime. I appreciate that in the moment, a lot of people don't know whether they should intervene, but my God, if you're watching a child being violently assaulted in a street by two other kids, you go and get the kid. You get the child, you make them safe. You're witnessing abuse. I know I said this on loads of videos, but risk offending people. Risk it. Risk getting bollocked off the mum or the dad for getting involved in something that you shouldn't have got involved in. Who cares if you protected a child? But people see this playing out in front of them and they let it continue. Another woman actually sees one of the boys pick James up and then notices that he puts him down again. And at that point, she notices that he's got a really fresh bump in the middle of his forehead, so she's concerned. Another woman, she's on a bus, so understandably she can't really do a lot about this. She looks and sees that one of the boys, who's at this point holding James, swings him really high above his shoulder. And that in itself didn't look like it was something that James was enjoying. It didn't look like it was a game. And she was really stunned because she was watching this play out and thinking, why on earth are these little kids in charge of a toddler? Why would any mum or dad allow two young boys who are clearly acting so recklessly access to look after their child? For me, it is beyond tragic, and I'm sure that this keeps some of the witnesses up at night, and I'm sure that it will keep poor James Bulger's mother and father up at night. The idea that there were so many opportunities to save James, so many people saw him with his abductors. Now, some said that they saw him laughing. I appreciate if you saw a child laughing, you're probably not going to consider that they're in danger. But again, it seems like for the most part, he wasn't laughing, he was crying. And others said that the boys looked like they were playing with him. So they didn't intervene because of that. But many, many others reported that they were absolutely doling out very aggressive behaviours to James. And other people reported that they saw his injuries and they actually heard him calling for his mother when he was being dragged along the road against his will. It seems mind-blowing that not one person out of nearly 40 did anything constructive. In fact, at one point, the boys stop at the park, and it's in this moment an old lady notices that James is really distressed and goes over and actually says, what's going on? So she's told by the boys they'd found him and he was lost. She then says, well, you need to take him to the police station, and she gave them directions, but then she watches them walk away in the opposite direction. If that had been me, and this is no disrespect to this individual, people make decisions that they regret and people don't think about the whole picture. She could well have thought that these boys were trying their best, but no, these kids were 10. You don't let somebody take a child to the police station that you've just suggested they should attend and then watch them go in the opposite direction without following. But that happens. Then there's another woman. Now she's with her young daughter at the time. She spots them outside shops and she is really concerned. Really concerned. So much so that she goes over and she actually says to James, are you okay? But he doesn't answer. I mean, he must have been terrified. And at one point, her own daughter actually held James's hand. Again, the boys tell her that he was lost and they say they're going to take him to the police station, but she's not happy with this explanation because she notes as they drag him away, this doesn't look normal. So she decides that the best way that she can actually help is to escort James to the police station herself. And at this moment, she actually says to a woman with a dog, look, can you keep an eye on my daughter whilst I take this little lost boy to the police station? The other woman said no. She said that her dog didn't like children. So they all watched as the toddler was dragged away. Again, it's hard to remain neutral and not feel very angry with people who put the priorities that they had about themselves over the priorities of this clearly injured child, but people make those decisions based on what they believe is occurring in the moment. But if she had taken that child to the police station, I wouldn't be telling this story. Yes, 2 young boys would have got into a lot of trouble, but we would not be talking about the death of this little baby boy. It's shocking that so many people saw and just ignored. And I guess that you could say, well, bystander intervention is something that plays out here, which is where lots of people see something occurring, everybody believes that somebody else is going to do something about it, inevitably ending up in somebody getting killed, for example, because nobody takes responsibility for the situation. But for me, if you see a child in distress, I don't really care who they are with. I'm going to be the kind of person that intervenes, and I can only implore all of you to do the same if you are ever in circumstances like that. Now, another point, the boys go into a pet shop and the owner is really concerned because they can note that the way they're tightly gripping James just doesn't seem okay. Again, doesn't question them though, just notices. Those boys walk for over 2.5 miles. 2.5 miles with this missing youngster. And whilst a few people question them, essentially they've been given free rein to beat him and abuse him all of that distance. This is at the point where Thompson and Venables arrive at the entrance to a railway. Multiple witnesses at this point say that they overheard the boys basically referring to James as their brother, complaining that they're having to look after their little brother and making out that they're annoyed with him because essentially they've been told to do a job and a duty that they don't want to do. Now that in itself shows you a level of cunning. They're kind of creating this drama where we're going to tell mum that we don't want to look after our brother anymore, it's not fair. And it's distracting people from the reality. So that shows, doesn't it, some premeditation, is certainly callousness and cunning behaviour. They're obviously aware at this point that by doing that, the adults who see them and hear them are going to presume that they are related, and they acted in an absolute way that was going to reinforce that presumption. That's what they are doing at this moment in time. Now, another witness, who was a 15-year-old girl at the time, she around 5:20 p.m. sees the toddler with the 2 older boys. At this point, they're yards from Walton Lane Police Station, and that Walton Lane Police Station is at the foot of the railway embankment. She said that she only watched them for about 10 seconds before she then walked on, but she noted at that point that James was literally being pushed towards the road. But she felt at that moment in time that apparently he was laughing. Apparently the boys seemed to be in that moment playing a game with him. Whether that's real or just imagined, I don't know. But that was her report. One of the boys then climbs down the embankment. Other one follows. He's carrying James in his arms. It's believed that she was literally the last witness to see that gorgeous little boy, James, alive. Even though he's been missing a few hours and people are now actively looking for him, and it's only been 2 hours, in fact, since they've taken James, it's gone dark. Which would be even more scary, wouldn't it? He's not been away from his mother in this way. He's with 2 strange kids, he's been injured, he's in a strange place, and now it's dark. Thompson and Venables then make their way down towards the tracks with James Bulger. At this point, Venables rips off the hood from James's anorak and he throws it into the bushes because he pulled the hood up on Jamie's injuries because he didn't want people to see earlier on. So as soon as he'd damaged his forehead, he'd kind of put the anorak hood up to ensure that it hid his injuries. He doesn't need to do that anymore. Why? You have to ask yourself that, don't you? Why would he be so confident that he did not need to cover up those bruises anymore? Because it strongly suggests, doesn't it, that they absolutely knew that at that point James would not be going any further. There wouldn't be any more witnesses to his injuries in that moment, because they weren't intending to take him anywhere else. I think it's fair to say that we're never absolutely going to know what their true mindset was when they decided to go ahead and carry out the most heinous and horrific acts that followed. We can definitely look at one option, which is that they'd literally always imagined that they were going to kill James. It had been their plan from the outset. But you also have to say to yourself, well, they acted shockingly aggressive in public. There were a hell of a lot of witnesses who saw the way that Jamie Bulger was being treated. And to some degree, we've seen that they've got a cunning behaviour. They're trying to let people know that he's really their brother. They're deflected by saying he's lost and so on and so forth. So they clearly know that other people will have seen them and been violent towards this little boy. They weren't trying to be unnoticed, so to speak. So it could also be argued that when they actually got to the embankment, to the train tracks, it's at this point they do decide that they're going to kill him. You know, maybe they fear that if they take him to the police, because they are near that police station, they're going to get questioned about his injuries. Again, I can't answer this. We may never know about the true motivation, but what we absolutely know about are the injuries that they inflicted on that defenceless toddler alongside the railway line near the former Walton and Anfield railway station in Walton, Liverpool. First of all, remember what I talked about earlier on, they were shoplifting. They threw the stolen blue modelling paint into James's face. Some of this went into his left eye and he screamed, understandably. Imagine how terrified he'd be. Some suggest that the reason that he threw that paint over little Jamie Bulger was they wanted to start dehumanising him, to make it easier so that they could carry out the horrific injuries they inflicted on him. Maybe. Possibly, though, they could just have been using whatever they had to hand to torture him, and they happened to have stolen that paint. And heartbreakingly, before this horrific assault ends up killing this beautiful little boy, according to Thompson and Venables, he actually said, "I want my mum." James wanted his mum. Isn't that just terrible? That this loving mother is desperately searching for her son, and simultaneously her son is searching for her. The two boys then create this sustained and vicious assault towards James. They shoved batteries in his mouth, they threw stones at him, they beat him, they kicked him, they stamped on his head, on his body. In fact, they were able to find lace mark indentations on the little boy's face. They hit him with bricks, and at some point they stripped him from his waist down. They pulled off his shoes, his trousers and his underpants, and the reason that it's believed they did that is because they also sexually assaulted him. When they were able to look at some of the injuries, they were able to establish that one of the injuries was that James's foreskin had been forcibly pulled back. They also believed that they might have inserted batteries into his anus. Neither of the boys have ever admitted to that, by the way, but nonetheless, it seems consistent with what the coroner and pathologist explored. Now, later in the separate police interviews, they genuinely both, for whatever reason, point blank refuse to answer any questions relating to the sexual element of this crime. During Venables being asked questions about this, well, he became absolutely hysterical, whereas Thompson, well, he just became very angry. He was incensed at being called a pervert. Like I said, though, this is what they believe played out. The professionals who investigated this, the pathologist, etc., felt it was consistent with a sexual assault.
You're under caution, and you do not have to say anything unless you wish to do so, but anything you say may be given in evidence. Now, you understand that, don't you, John?
Yeah.
Alright. I have a photograph here, which is a video camera photograph.
That's me. That's me.
So, the boy holding James's hand is you.
Yeah.
And the boy ahead of you, in the dark jacket and trousers, Robert Thompson. And what was it you told us?
I killed James.
Right. Now, I know that took a lot of doing.
I can't tell you anything else.
Why?
That's the worst bit.
Why? Okay, right. I know that's the worst bit, but you know what you did. Right. Think about it. Right. And just tell us what happened.
He took me on the rail shop and started throwing bricks at him. And then
Who did?
Robbie.
Why did he throw bricks at him?
No.
Where did the stones and the bar hit him?
In the head.
Was he bleeding?
Or neither.
Where was he bleeding from?
Face. Then it was Robert's idea to kill him.
Okay.
Many of the actual injuries that James experienced were also experienced after they had removed his clothes. And the nature of the wounds that he had to his legs evidence this, because as well as this horrific assault that I've just described, they finally strike him in the head with an iron bar, a rusted railway fish plate that was 20 inches long. It weighed 22 pounds to 10 kilograms. Now this injury alone, this striking to the head alone, would cause 10 skull fractures. Remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about primary school kids. Primary school kids. Once the boys are convinced that James is dead, they then decide that they need to try to cover the tracks. This means that they clearly in that moment understood that what they had done was wrong. Because why would you cover your tracks? If you think that this is something that's acceptable, you're not going to try to get away with it, right? But that's not what happens. They desperately try to make James's death look like an accident. They lay his body across the railway track, and then they cover his head with bricks and rubble because they want to keep him in place. And then after they have decimated this little boy's body, after they have tortured this little boy, this innocent child, and covered him with rubble, placed him on the train tracks, they just walk away. A train later on actually ran little James Bulger's body over. He was sliced clean in two. The Home Office pathologist who had to seek out how James Bulger had died was able to establish that he'd suffered 42 injuries. Just think about this child, he's just coming up for 3 years of age. Think how tiny he is. 42 injuries. Those 42 injuries comprised of 22 bruises, splits and grazes to his face and head, and 20 wounds on his body. That included multiple fractures to his skull, and the fractures extended from his jaw across his forehead, basically over the entirety of his skull. The right side of his skull as well was just completely shattered. And because of that, there had been extensive brain damage. And there was actually a brain damage injury that was so severe it caused a hemorrhage at the centre. Also, he had loads of extensive bruising to the area around his right cheek, around his ear. He had this grooved mark that had been left by stamping or kicking. And it was actually described in the report as a severe blow, and it had left a pattern from the footwear. They also found damage to the mouth, to the lower lip, and the extent of the forceful impact of the bricks was actual evidenced by the fact that the nicks and brick dust were found in James's anorak, scarf and underpants, so they could evidence that these bricks had been thrown or used to hit him forcefully in that way. It's also believed that when Venables and Thompson walked away after placing James on that train track, he was still alive. The pathologist concluded that he'd have endured a short period of survival after the attack. He'd suffered so many injuries that trying to conclude which had killed him was impossible. They didn't know what the fatal blow was. What they could say was that mercifully he was actually dead before the train severed his body. 3 years old. It's like describing something out of some kind of horrific horror movie, isn't it? Not the end of this gorgeous little 3-year-old boy. Now, of course, Thompson and Venables have carried out this brutal attack, and now they kind of need to get on with the rest of their day. And they go to a friend's house. At this friend's house, they knock on. He's not home. So then they're like loitering around on the streets for a while. They end up in a video shop. This is about 6 p.m. And they were literally looking at videos, so hardly panicking, by the way, hardly beside themselves, hardly trying to figure out what to do next. They're just looking at videos. And then this woman enters the shop. She's seen in the shop to just grab hold of Venables, and then she's shouting at Thompson, and that actually was Susan. That was Venables' mother. Now, she had been so concerned about the fact that Venables hadn't returned home that she had reported her son missing to the police. And she's so incensed in this moment that she ends up dragging both of the boys out of the shop. She's screaming at them. She's hitting them. Even though Thompson doesn't belong to her, she's hitting him, which is highly inappropriate. And Thompson ends up running away. She then heads for the local police station at 7:15 because obviously she's told them that her son's missing, and now she wants to notify the officers that she's found him. Now, one of the reasons that she was so panic-stricken is that in what can only be said is an ironic twist, she knows that a little boy has been kidnapped from a shopping centre. So she's telling Venables that this is why she's so worried. She's so terrified because she thought too that he might have been abducted. She knows that the police haven't found the person responsible. She felt that her son could have been a victim. She could have been dealing with an abduction herself. So she wound herself up to such a degree. Understandably, though, for any other parent listening, if you find out, as Thompson's mother finds out, that Venables' mother has basically shouted at him and beaten him to some degree, there are going to be some strong repercussions, aren't there, no matter what? So at 7:48 p.m, Thompson's mum, Anne, she complains to the police and says that her son's been assaulted by Susan, which to some degree was actually true, albeit that we understand why Susan was in such a state. The police have been gathering data all day at this point. They've viewed CCTV from the shopping mall, and their first assumption was James had been abducted by an adult. Now, CCTV then isn't as it was today. I mean, these days it's like in 4K, isn't it? You can like literally home in on tiny details on somebody, but back then it was quite grainy. So they'd initially anticipated that this was adults who'd have carried out the crime, but the two figures that they noticed don't seem to be adults. Now they're believing that they're two youths, and the assumption is maybe they were teenagers that had led him away. And you can imagine that in that moment, people might have taken a breath and thought, oh, hang on a minute. If they're teenagers, it's unlikely he's come to any serious harm. Maybe this is just a horrible mix-up, because that's what you want to do. It's what you want to believe. Kids wouldn't do this, surely. Surely if it's teenagers, it's going to be okay. But it wasn't okay. 2 days later, on the 14th of February, 1993, James's mutilated body was found by teenagers. They were playing on the railway embankment. They thought there was a broken doll. That's what they saw. Can you imagine how it felt for them? Seeing that this is not a doll, this is a child who has literally been cut in half. The trauma they would have experienced. Instantly they run to the nearby police station. They tell the officers. When the police arrive on the scene, they're just utterly blown away. They cannot believe what they're seeing. These injuries on the toddler. The investigators are able to establish that James had been laid with top half of his body inside the tracks, and because of the way the train had impacted, the lower half of his body had actually been carried further down the tracks from the impact of the train. They noticed that his clothing had been removed from the waist down, and that clothing had actually been laid near his head, so they could tell it had been taken off him. They also noted that his underwear was really heavily stained and soaked with blood. They also found a blood-stained iron bar. They found blood-stained stones and bricks. They were also able to recover 3 AA batteries that were near his body, and they found the tin of blue modelling paint that began the assault, so to speak, at those train tracks. The whole nation was just utterly stunned. And don't get me wrong, they weren't letting all of this information about the brutality of the murder out. It was drip-fed over a long period of time, but what we knew at that moment in time was this beautiful little boy had been taken and would never go home. We knew that he'd been murdered. Then we get the tributes, and there's masses of floral tributes everywhere. They leave them near the spot where the toddler died, and they are huge amounts. What blows my mind, though, is Robert Thompson actually went with a neighbour to leave flowers. Now, I appreciate that children will do what they're told in lots of circumstances, and I don't think that we're reading into it in the way that we would a serial killer who is sinister and wants to be at the centre of the crime. But it also demonstrates the fact that Thompson was able to retain some composure. He knows what played out there, yet he goes with that person and lays flowers. It doesn't take them long, by the way, to arrest Thompson and Venables, because they enhance the images and they notice that these images clearly demonstrate younger children, so not teenagers. They then put out the pictures of the actual CCTV that have been enhanced, and they show it on national TV. Straight away, a local woman recognises them. She'd seen them on the day that they were truanting from school. That was on the day that James was taken, on the 18th of February 1993. So it's so quick that Thompson and Venables get arrested. And then they do the forensic testing, and bear in mind, these are kids, they're not forensically sophisticated. They're not wealthy either, so it's not like they can go and get a whole new set of clothes and dispose of the items that they were wearing that day. So they're able, when they do the forensic testing, to take their shoes, for example, and they find blood on their shoes. They find blood from Thompson's right shoe that matches the DNA profile of James's blood. The Home Office forensic scientist was actually able to testify that literally the likelihood of an error as regards connecting that blood of James with what was found on the shoes was 1 in a billion. So it was clear that these are the perpetrators. They also found James's hair on Robert Thompson's shoes. They found modelling paint on James and at the scene, and it was on both of the boys' clothing. There was paint in the toe cap even of one of Venables' shoes, and that meant that they could see that he would have kicked James with a certain force to have actually taken that off. And all the while that the police are gathering this information and the forensic scientists are bringing up this data, they are in shock. They cannot believe that they are dealing with 2 children of this age. They had absolutely presumed that if the perpetrators were kids of any age, they would be teenagers, not 2 10-year-old boys. Apparently, after the arrest, Thompson asked the police whether James had been taken to hospital to get him alive again. That was a quote that was recorded. The detective who was working on Merseyside's serious crime squad at the time, who actually questioned Thompson and Venables, stated this: they were a match made in hell, a freak of nature. They went out that day to kill. I truly believe that. And if they hadn't been caught, I fear they would have struck again. Pure evil. I will never change my mind about that. On the 20th of February 1993, Thompson and Venables, rightly so, are both charged with the James's abduction and murder, but they're also charged with the attempted abduction of another child on the same day that they'd actually killed James. They get remanded in custody, clearly, because it's such a serious crime. Also, I imagine for their own safety, because the national fury it created was something that is rarely seen. So probably for their own protection, and because they were clearly seen as a danger to society, they are remanded in custody whilst awaiting trial. They both plead, by the way, at this point, not guilty to the charges against them. That's very childish, isn't it? I didn't do it. But that's what they're going for initially. I'm not guilty. I didn't do that. Now, initially, because they were so young, They decided that they were going to refer to the children as Child A, that was Thompson, and Child B, that was Venables, because they wanted to protect their anonymity, because it hadn't been decided whether the crime was considered to such a heinous level in the public interest to a degree where they should be exposed, as in they had carried out something so disastrous, so diabolical, so despicable that the general public should be afforded the knowledge of who these children were. But at this point, they're just Child A and Child B. Thompson and Venables were interviewed with police for like more than 20 hours. And as is the case in so many criminal cases, actually, this is not just to do with being young. This is genuinely just to do with being a criminal who's involved with another criminal when you carry out a crime. All this snitches get stitches and don't grass just doesn't kind of follow when people are getting interrogated. And these kids are exactly the same. They just blame each other for James's death. What they get out of Thompson initially is that, yes, we were at the shopping centre, we had seen James with his mum, but we hadn't taken him. Said that they'd just left the Strand, they'd gone to the library. I'm not sure these were the kind of kids who'd often go to the library, but that's his story. Maybe he's trying to throw out that, yes, I was truanting from school, but I'm deeply studious. But that's what he says. They'd gone to the library and then gone home. Later on, he does change his story. And when he changes his story to kind of admitting that he's involved with the killing, he blames Venables for taking James. He also says that whilst he was present, it was actually Venables who had killed James. He said that James was killed in a way where Venables used bricks and threw bricks at his face, hit him with an iron bar. He also said that he'd actually tried to stop Venables at the time, tried to pull him away. He said that he had a little brother of his own, and therefore, if he had wanted to kill a little baby, he'd have killed him. Skewed logic, doesn't make any sense, but there's a level of desperation there, isn't there? Just trying to evidence that he has access to other kids. He could have killed any kid. Why get a kid from a shopping centre and kill that child when he had access to his own brothers? You know, that is very childish, but again, heaping the responsibility on Venables at this point. Now, unlike Thompson, who, I'll be honest with you, was unnervingly calm and unnervingly composed when he was with the investigators, Venables wasn't. Venables was literally hysterical from the outset. Now, he initially denies everything, says he wasn't even in the Strand shopping centre, but then he admits that he was in the Strand centre, but he definitely didn't take James. Now, when they told him that Thompson said that he had taken James by the hand, Venables gets hysterical, because of course they've got this on CCTV, but now they're bringing in the fact that Thompson to some degree has turned against Venables. It's a tactic that interrogators use, investigators use. They want to make that person feel that the story that they're telling is being disputed by a co-conspirator, so to speak. So Venables is distressed and distraught. He says that Thompson's a complete liar. But then Venables ends up having a conversation with his mum. And it's her, it feels, that manages to get Venables to recognise that he has nowhere to go with this and that he's going to have to tell the truth. So Venables at this point, after speaking with his mum, it must have been incredibly difficult for her. Imagine hearing that your child is the person who's abducted and murdered that little boy. A child that recently yourself you'd feared could have been abducted. Hence why she was so angry with Venables and Thompson. And yet here she is, sat, convincing her own son to take responsibility for this beyond heinous murder. Now, Venables, as you will imagine, is still looking to play the less guilty card. He says it was all Thompson's idea. He admits that he took James to the train track. He admits that he attacked him, but he said that Thompson was actually the one who threw bricks. Also, he blamed Thompson for stripping James's clothes from his lower body. He also says to the police, would you say sorry to James's mum? So he's now acknowledging that the impact of this murder is going to affect other people. And clearly there's a childishness about that, as if she's going to care about an apology from such a heinous murderer. The public outcry and rage about this crime was so immense, so intense, so enormous that Thompson and Venables' parents had to be given new identities. They had to be given new identities. They had to be put in totally new places in different parts of the country, the entire family, because people wanted blood. They believed that these kids had been created, and therefore those who had created them were culpable. So the cost to the public taxpayer was enormous. But think about that. The entire family had to be moved, relocated, and given new identities to stop them potentially receiving great harm through the public. The trial begins. This is at Preston Crown Court. It's the 1st of November, 1993. I'm actually in Preston at that point in university. Isn't it crazy? That was the next to the last year for me. I'm there. The case is everywhere. Thompson and Venables were the youngest defendants in UK legal history to be tried for murder in the 20th century. That's how unique this case was. Now, despite the fact that they're incredibly young, by the time it gets to trial, they're 11 years of age, it's decided that they would be tried as adults. Now, because they were going to be tried as adults, it meant that there were certain things that they weren't allowed to do in court, so they were not permitted to sit with their parents. Instead, they had to sit in the dock, and that meant that there were guards there, also social workers because of their age. Now, it didn't mean that the parents weren't present. The parents were actually within touching distance, but they weren't afforded the opportunity of sitting directly with the parent to be comforted. Kind of heartbreaking to describe this, no excuse at all about the crime and no empathy and sympathy for the boys who carried it out in this respect, but it kind of pulls on the heartstrings to know that the boys' seats had to be raised because they were so small that they couldn't see the proceedings over the railings of the dock unless they raised the seats. And it would be very confusing for them, wouldn't it? Anybody who's been in court, the language that's used, even if you're deeply intellectual yourself, is very difficult to understand. It's a very strange, antiquated experience. So for these kids, it would just be very, very odd. And I doubt that they understood the complexities of what was being discussed any time. Now, currently under UK law, there is a doctrine of dollae inca pax. Now, dollae inca pax presumes that a child under the age of 10 is just incapable of committing a crime. So if I translate it, it literally means incapable of committing evil. But in 1993, this rule applied to 10 to 14-year-olds. So in 1993, when this crime played out, dollae inca pax meant that as far as the courts were concerned, a child of their age group was not able to actually be prosecuted in the way that an adult would because they didn't get what they had done. So accordingly to that rule, Thompson and Venables were immune to criminal prosecution unless the prosecution could first prove beyond reasonable doubt that they absolutely knew what they were doing was seriously wrong. They had to prove that the boys weren't just acting, shall we say, in a naughty or mischievous way. Ultimately, I'll be honest, the prosecution did not have a problem proving this, because if you think about the boys' conduct, it genuinely isn't surprising. I mean, to suggest to witnesses that James was their brother or was lost or they're taking him to the police station, the fact that they tried to make the crime look like an accident because they left James's body on the railway track, and also, let's be honest, just the horrific, brutal nature of the way that they killed and tortured James, it absolutely implies, doesn't it, that they knew what they were doing was seriously wrong. But in spite of the fact that it was pretty easy to prove that they knew, the prosecution of the two children at that time still caused a hell of a lot of controversy. So on one side, you had like thousands of people, I mean hundreds outside the court alone, who were basically like, hang them, literally that's what they were saying. They were like, hang the children, which, with respect, guys, as much as it provokes the most heinous feelings within us and the most righteous rage I think we're entitled to, the idea of like hanging 2 11-year-old kids is just terrifying. The idea that anybody would think that that was appropriate no matter what they did. They're 11, but it shows you the feeling that was being provoked. Then others felt that Thompson and Venables were actually too young to be subjected to this adult criminal trial. They felt that putting these kids in front of a judge and a court and barristers in full court regalia was just not appropriate, that they were very young children and that they should have been treated as such. During the trial, one of the things that the prosecution worked on really, really hard was they worked on trying to paint Robert Thompson as the ringleader. They wanted to bring it out as if he was this kind of thug who had led Venables astray. The reasoning they believe that the prosecution went with this in particular is because Robert Thompson was quite numb in the way that he acted. He was quite stoic. People said he was very defiant in the way that he stared during the trial. But Venables, well, he broke down all the time. It's contextual with prior behaviours. He's a lot more emotional, so he would regularly weep. But if you're going to look at it that way, you're literally being far too simplistic. You can't appraise these kids' characters because one seems to stare into space or stare at particular people or doesn't really seem to get emotional, and another one gets highly emotional and decide, oh, well, that one's the less guilty party. It isn't the way that psychology works. And if I'm really honest, my research and the evidence that's been presented, as far as I can see, is that it really does feel like it was Venables' idea to take James to the railway line. So as much as they're painting Robert Thompson as the main instigator here, it's not playing out in reality as far as I'm concerned. And this evidence is also supported down the line because quite a lot of information comes out to show that Venables is living a really troubled childhood. Even though he'd had a, shall we say, less dysfunctional upbringing, there were lots of issues that showed him to be a highly troubled child. Now, the evidence against these two boys is obviously massively overwhelming because aside from all of the obvious forensic evidence that I've described, there was damning forensic evidence, they also had 38 witnesses who came and took the stand. Now, I don't think you needed all those witnesses, but I think that the prosecution was acutely aware that people were on two sides of a fence here. They wanted to prove beyond any doubt that these boys were culpable for the murder and that these boys had knowingly and willingly led that little child to his death. So they call these 38 witnesses, and of course they testify to having seen James walking with Thompson and Venables. Of course, they've also got the CCTV footage of them literally leading James from the shopping centre. If ever there is a case where it's banged to rights, you are banged to rights in that moment. You have forensic, you have witness testimony, and you have CCTV showing you literally becoming the perpetrators. There is no way that there could be any confusion as to who carried out this crime. Also, the prosecution really go for the throats. They say that the boys had absolutely intentionally, with premeditated value, gone to kill James that day or at least cause him serious injury. And they said that because of this, that showed the mental element required for murder. They stated that both had acted jointly throughout, and they also made it very clear, as far as the prosecution was concerned, that both of those boys knew exactly what they were doing. They knew it was seriously wrong. Neither of the boys actually gave evidence at the trial because the psychological experts who were involved in the case had said that literally neither of the boys was ever going to be able to meaningfully converse in a way that could have explained what they did in the crime. And this meant, accordingly, the police interviews were the things that were played to the court. And the police interviews are very difficult to listen to because what you feel more than anything is these are little boys. just their voices themselves, it's distressing to hear them. It's distressing to hear them talk about what's going on. And like I said, this is so rare because of their age.
This interview is being tape recorded. I'm Detective Sergeant Roberts. Now, what's your full name?
Robert Thompson.
What do they call you, Robert or Bobby?
Walden.
I think Bobby's a more friendly name. Do you agree?
Yeah.
I just want to know a little bit about you now, okay? What's your hobby then?
Skipping school.
Skipping school, is that right?
That's not a hobby, that's a profession, Bobby, when you do it as well as you.
Bobby, I came round to your house this morning, didn't I?
Yeah.
What did I say to you?
Listening.
Correct. What for?
James.
James, what about James?
That you said on suspicion of murdering.
Well, very well remembered. Did you ever see him in the Strand? You shook your head again.
Yeah.
Bobby, was that on the day that we're talking about? Was that on this Friday? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were going up the escalators. They were coming through the doors that there's loads of.
Who was he with?
No.
Little James.
There's one.
With his mum. He was just running around, was he, James?
Yeah.
Will you tell me exactly what? Slowly, right?
Just said come here. And then he grabbed his hands and walked up to stand.
How did he come up to John?
How did you come up to John?
James.
No, he was walking around the strand.
Who was? James?
The baby.
Was he?
I told him to take him back.
You did what?
Told him to take him back.
You told him to take it back?
It's all right, Bobby. No, you're not getting all the blame. I'm just asking your son. We're trying to find it.
I'll make the blame.
Wait a minute, Bobby. You see, little James is following you up on stage. Right? But on another picture, John, it appears as if John had hold of his hand.
Yeah, well, why are you questioning me and John as well?
John saying to us that he wasn't down at the Strand.
But we were.
I know you were at the Strand, but why should he lie to us by saying that he wasn't in the Strand? He's scared of saying that he was down in the Strand because something happened, didn't it?
Not the baby got took.
Yeah.
Not by me.
We certainly admitted throwing stones and things like that.
But he's blaming you for a lot of things.
Yeah, but why
You
is he
understand?
blaming me?
Well, I want to know the truth, right? The whole truth. There's other things going on, isn't there? I know the truth. I believe you know the truth.
I was there.
That's
You
right.
waved.
Correct. But I know there's a lot of things that have gone on.
Yeah, well, do you know what you need that killed him? It wasn't. I never even killed him. I'm gonna end up getting all the blame because I've got blood on me.
We're asking you, son, and we want you to tell you us the truth, that's all. Not give the blame to you or anything else. But it's only the truth that we're
Yeah,
saying.
but Johnny's still breaking his face.
Can we just go through it slowly, right? What John did with what, right? You said he got hit with a brick first, did he? Then, what did he do?
Lovely.
He threw another brick.
2055.
Am I able to go home tonight?
We don't know yet, And I want you to tell me.
I don't need to answer any more questions, do I?
Come on now, Bobby.
That one would want to kill him when I've got a baby of my own.
I'm trying
If I
to.
wanted to kill a baby, I'd kill my own, wouldn't I?
Was he able to talk?
Yeah.
James,
Yeah.
what did he say to you?
He said that the two of you were in the Strand and that you saw the little boy.
We never. Yeah, we was, but we never saw any kids there. We never robbed any kids.
So you were in Bootle New Strand.
Was you in Bootle Strand?
We never got a kid, Mum. We never.
Would you? I must ask you not to get angry with him.
I never got the boy. I never killed him.
And he said that you took him by the hand and led him out of the strand shop.
He never. He's a liar.
Calm down.
Alright, it's alright. Come on, look.
But the God's honest truth.
God knows the truth. I'm telling you that he never. He was too scared. He was probably too scared.
A short while ago, as is detailed on your custody record out there, you had a conversation with your mum and you then requested that myself come into the room. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was it you told us?
That I killed James. So we walked up to him and we were walking around with him and I took his hand.
Well, whose idea was it to walk towards him?
Mine.
Was it? What did
Then
you
it was Robert's idea to kill him. And we went outside to the canal.
What for?
Don't know, he said let's throw him in the water. He was persuading him. He said kneel down, let's look at the water and all that, but he wouldn't. Because when we wouldn't get him down, Robert picked him up and threw him on the floor and that's where he got his bump on his head.
What were you gonna? Why were you taking on to Rotten Village?
Don't know, he didn't know what to do.
You walk along where?
To the train shop. We took him on the rail shop. He started throwing bricks at him. I didn't throw any bricks because Robert said pick a brick up and throw it. I just threw it on the floor.
What was Robert saying while he was doing all this?
He was saying stay down, you stupid baby and all that.
Why did he want him to stay down?
Don't know. Wanted him dead probably.
Where did the stones in the bar hit him?
In the head.
And you say the bar knocked him out?
Yeah. Onto the railway track.
What happened then?
No, he was just lying there.
On the 24th of November 1993, this is after a trial that lasted more than 3 weeks, as a jury of 9 men and 3 women. They found Thompson and Venables guilty of James's abduction and murder. They absolutely did not struggle with that verdict. At this point, Judge Mr. Justice Morland, he orders them to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. And so this is basically the youth equivalent of an adult life sentence. And he recommended that they needed to have a minimum of 8 years served. He did describe, in spite of the fact that a lot of people may think that that sentence is far too lenient, it's not that he did not take this crime very seriously. He did. He referred to it as an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. That minimum 8-year term, it was actually later increased to 10 years. And the reason for that was there was just an enormous public outrage. They felt, we all did, that even though these boys were very little, the gravity of the crime was so despicable that it needed to be reflected in the years served. So they then increased that sentence to 10 years. And then the Home Secretary at the time, Michael Howard, well, he actually goes further and he increases it to 15 years. And part of that is because Jamie Bulger's family passionately lobbied. This was their child. This was their little boy. He'd had his whole future stolen. They wanted more justice. They managed to get 278,000 people to sign that petition. And bear in mind, we're talking about a time, not like now, where you can do a change.org petition and get millions of signatures quickly. I mean, for God's sake, they managed to get about 4 million to try to get rid of Amber Heard from Aquaman 2, didn't they, using that? What I'm saying is 278,000 signatures in an old school climate where you didn't have the internet in the way that you have today. It demonstrates the passion that they felt as a family to make sure that James was given the legacy, the justice that he deserved. But even though Michael Howard did that, the European Court of Human Rights decided that that was inappropriate. I don't know why they interfered, but they did. They decided that they had a right to interfere because obviously the European Court of Human Rights did then have the option to overturn certain rulings. And they say that Thompson and Venables have been denied a fair trial because they were so young and because they've been tried as adults. They said that because of this, they were far too young to follow the proceedings. They wouldn't have understood the nature of the adult court. So that term was subsequently reduced back to the original 8 years, which I think would have been utterly devastating for James Bulger's family, genuinely. It doesn't feel a very long time, does it? Also, I know well where they were held. So my ex-husband works at Barton Moss Secure Care Centre in Manchester, and that's where Thompson went. And I've also, in my years, worked with an individual who worked directly with him. They're not at that centre, and I'm not going to disclose any confidential information. But what I will say is that it was traumatising for the worker who had to work as a key person in that person's life because of the information that they obviously learnt. But nonetheless, Barton Moss Secure Care Centre is a place, it's not like a prison at all, it's a place where kids are treated very, very well. They are given access to a whole range of interventions from therapy, great diets, they get to play lots of games, they get to have fun with one another, and the workers are deeply devoted. There is a much bigger ratio of adult worker to child. So to some degree, even though Thompson was being placed in secure, to some degree, it was an environment that may have been far superior to the life that he was leading on the outside. And his mother visited him every 3 days. Venables, he was taken elsewhere. He was detained in Vardy House. That's at Red Bank Secure Unit in St Helens on Merseyside again. His parents regularly visited him too. It was later suggested down the line that Venables suffered from PTSD after James's brutal murder, and apparently at every single court appearance he would change his clothes, and the reason that he would change his clothes is that he said he could smell James on him. He said he had a baby smell on everything. Every time he wore clothes, that's what manifested. And during the trial, he would often ask his parents, do you think that baby James is there in the courtroom? Also, Venables, in the years that followed, started to suffer from really serious flashbacks and nightmares. And apparently one of the things that provoked further these nightmares, these flashbacks, is that he felt this guilt that James actually seemed to like him when they abducted him. So James had allowed Venables to pick him up, allowed him to carry him. So this manifested over the years in his conscience as a very heavy guilt, which he deserves, by the way, but I'm saying at least we're seeing the integrity of somebody starting to develop an understanding of the actions and the consequences that followed. Don't get me wrong, we have a whole heap to go into about Venables and who he is now. Like I said, no empathy and sympathy, just giving you the information that I'm aware of. Venables ended up actually at certain points believing that baby James was growing inside him. And the belief was that the psychological practitioners thought this was a way of him trying to psychologically make amends for his crime, to somehow rebirth James. I guess we could say there is an element potentially of remorse, but there is also another bit of me that, if I'm really honest, knowing where Venables is today, that we'll talk about in a little while, I kind of also think it speaks to a very disturbed mind. I think that Venables is probably an individual with serious mental health issues. Where Thompson is concerned, he turned his life around. He really did. Whilst he was in custody and afforded that particular placement, which I will tell you is a placement full of opportunity for young people, he progressed really well. He really did. He developed lots of interests. He had a real talent for art. He ended up passing 5 GCSEs. He actually went on to take his A-levels. So for him, he thrived. Just challenging, isn't it? Robert Thompson, who murders this little boy, he actually thrives. He starts to really progress. Thompson and Venables end up getting released on lifelong license, so that means that their actions for the rest of their life will mean that if they fail to apply themselves to those license restrictions, they will be returned to prison. It's important. They've shown that they are people who have great malice within them, potentially can do great harm. At the time that they get released, they're 18 years of age. I have to note, in spite of his horrible actions, Thompson hasn't reoffended since being released. And his identity, which many of you will know, but for those of you who don't, is protected. So there is literally a worldwide injunction preventing the press and people from sharing his identity. In 2006, there was actually a report that a 23-year-old Robert Thompson was now living in a stable gay relationship in the Northwest. And as far as anyone is concerned, he's still in that long-term relationship. So he is getting on with his life. He's obviously got qualifications. He's certainly not acting out to a point where the authorities are becoming aware of him. Same can't be said for Venables, though. And bear in mind what was said, they tried to paint Robert Thompson as the main perpetrator. Simple as that. But actually, it doesn't seem that it's played out that way when you look at their offending behaviour, because Thompson has had none. He's stable. Whereas Venables, well, we have a bit of a rap sheet to go through. So first of all, and this is not okay, by the way, and this is not his fault either, before he gets released from Red Bank when he's 17, allegedly he has sex with a female care worker. Now that is horrific. That is an absolute overreach of authority and power being used against a child. He's 17, he's legal, I appreciate that, but he's vulnerable. He's meant to be being cared for in a unit where child protection and safeguard isn't in place, and yet he's having sex with a female care worker. So that's an abuse situation playing out right there. Then after his release, he apparently starts to suffer from quite severe depression. This is in line with what we've talked about regarding PTSD, the trauma that he feels, the levels of mental decline he's experienced during his time there. But now he's free, he starts drinking, he starts taking drugs. And again, many people self-medicate when they are struggling. So drugs and alcohol is what he's turning to. He gets arrested twice in 2008. This is first for a Section 4 public order offence. Basically, he got involved in a small scuffle outside a nightclub. And then later he gets caught for a possession of a small amount of cocaine. But then in 2010, Venables seriously breaches the conditions of his release. And I mean seriously, because he is charged with committing child pornography offences. At this point, I'm out. I'm okay with talking about Thompson and the fact that Robert Thompson is somebody who seems to have changed his life around, and whether we agree that he should be allowed to be free or otherwise, he's not apparently doing damage to our world. But Venables, he's been afforded the opportunities to change. He's had help at Red Bank. Yes, there have been some horrible errors in the way that he's been treated, but nonetheless, he now has an opportunity of freedom. He's got a new identity. To all intents and purposes, he could and should be living in a way that means that he will not be returned to prison. But he goes for committing child pornography offences. Now, the reason that the police actually find out about this is because at this point in time, he is seen to be uncovered identity-wise. So somebody out there recognises that he is this particular individual, this is Venables, and it's free, and starts letting people know that they have recognised him and they therefore compromise his identity, which means that the police have to instantly rush to his house to take him into protective custody before basically somebody murders him. And at the point that they do that, they find him trying to destroy his computer hard drive. Not the best thing to be doing when the police arrive to take you into protective custody. Because it kind of instantly is a red flag, isn't it? It's like, why are you destroying your computer hard drive when we're coming to protect you? obviously he's trying to hide the images. Now, he does later admit, because he has to, that he's downloaded and distributed child abuse images. Bear in mind, it's horrific that he is viewing these images, but he's actually taking part in furthering the abuse by distributing them. This includes, by the way, material of children as young as 2 being raped by adults. Like I said, I'm out at this point. Return him to prison forever, in my opinion. Forever. Also, they found that he'd visited social networking sites and he'd even gone and talked online with a convicted paedophile, where Venables disguises himself as a woman, essentially takes on this persona of a woman who's got an 8-year-old child with whom she is apparently abusing. So he's literally created an alter ego where he is a female paedophile and he's engaging in this kind of inappropriate conversation and discussion with a known paedophile. At this point, he gets sentenced to a further 2 years. I think he should have got longer, but he got 2 years. The authorities were apparently shocked. I'm not sure why you would be shocked by this. This is a child who was involved in the abduction, brutal slaying, and then trying to cover up of one of the most torturous crimes you've ever heard of. Why would it shock you that he had this kind of mindset? But they basically believed that he was rehabilitated. They had no clue whatsoever about his paedophilic tendencies. Also, they then found out that even though he wasn't allowed to be visiting Merseyside because this is in breach of his parole terms, he had been doing. So he wasn't concerned about the restrictions that had been placed on him. He just went ahead and broke them. Also, they found out they had loads of girlfriends. And do you know what was in common with these girlfriends? They were all in their teens. He was in his mid-20s at this point. Now, people said that the reason that he was dating teenagers was because he was just experiencing a delayed adolescence. Okay, well, that's still not okay, is it? I don't care how delayed his adolescence was. And also, was it a delayed adolescence? Wasn't he having it away with one of the care workers at Red Bank? Not sure that's a delayed adolescence. I just think that's an unhealthy interest in younger people. When Venables gets reconvicted, the Lord Chancellor and Secretary of the State for Justice, they went ahead and commissioned Sir David Ormond to undertake an independent review. They wanted him to investigate the management of Venables following his release in 2001. Bear in mind, he's meant to have really strict licensing terms, and yet somehow he's been viewing child pornography, distributing child pornography, pretending to be a mother abusing her child to engage in inappropriate conversations with a paedophile, visiting an area that he's not allowed to go to, and he's also been caught for a scuffle outside a club and possession of an illegal drug. You're going to have to say at this moment in time, there have been some problems in managing him. So they want to know how he came to reoffend, and that actually concluded, that report concluded, and sorry that I'm smiling a little bit, but sometimes, you know, when you're like, here, I'm going to implore you to investigate whether we could have done a better job. You go off and let's see whether you come back and say that we are in any way to blame, or whether the perpetrator is the person to blame. And ultimately, the report came back and was like, only Venables is to blame. Authorities aren't to blame at all. Well, I mean, I think the fact that a care worker was sleeping with him in Red Bank is probably a little bit of a red flag. And the fact that surely they should be tracking where he is. He's a terrifyingly dangerous human being. But anyway, this report stated that there was nothing in Venables' record that could actually suggest that he was a danger to society when he was released. Personally, I am completely on the side of James Bulger's parents, who claim that the review was a whitewash. It was, wasn't it? So what's that? We're innocent completely. I found you innocent completely. Who employed you? You did. Job well done. Job well done. Give him a raise. actually, we've got quite a few other reports that we need you to write. Is it just me? I imagine that's exactly how James Bulger's parents felt. And I kind of agree with James Bulger's parents. Firstly, they feel that he got released when he wasn't ready. Secondly, how can they say that there were no risk factors when it came down to Venables? He literally murdered a child. Also, they believe that there was a sexual element to that killing, so therefore there is a sexual interest in children. Then when he gets caught as a paedophile, people don't link that. Sorry, but I find that report bizarre. 2018, Venables again gets recalled to prison, serves another 40 months. And do you know why? Do you know why this man who has been given a new identity, who has been afforded protection to the point where he's actually caught with pornography when they're trying to protect him, is now back in prison because he admitted to possessing a manual detailing how to have sex with little girls? What has that got to do with a stunted adolescence? That's about having an absolute fixation with having sex with children, abusing children, and it's in line with his behaviour. He also at this point admits that he has over 1,000 child abuse images. How is this being allowed to occur? That a man who has murdered a beautiful little boy, who has been given every opportunity to reform, has then gone out and literally continued to be depraved. In March 2019, a judge ruled that Venables would be able to keep his anonymity because they want to protect him from serious harm, from serious violence. It's also worth noting, guys, that he's actually up for parole again this autumn. And the authorities have figured out that they maybe need to think about resettling him abroad because they don't feel that the UK is going to potentially be safe for him, but also he is so expensive to maintain in the UK because so many people are out for his blood that it's possible they're going to consistently have to move him and look after him, that they're thinking about placing him somewhere abroad. I have a suggestion. Is Alcatraz still available? I mean, I think it's closed, but it's still there. Can we not just drop him there? I don't know. With a bag of seeds and a loaf of bread. Let him fend for himself. I doubt anyone would try and find him there either. I'm just throwing it out there. See this as a public service of me coming up with some very appropriate ideas about rehousing this monster. Another theory that more recently has been suggested is that the reason that Thompson and Venables went ahead and killed James Bulger is because they were really jealous. I mean, without doubt, James was a child who was absolutely adored. He was loved beyond measure, beyond reason. He was everything to his parents. Whereas Venables apparently had siblings that had quite considerable special educational needs, and he was really jealous of the attention that they got. And allegedly Thompson was also jealous of the fact that his new baby sibling had been born and was getting a lot of attention. One of the things that people drew parallels over was that James Bulger bore a strong resemblance to the sibling. But now the reason that I don't buy into that theory is because at the end of the day, yeah, he was a love child without a doubt, but they wouldn't have had insight into that. I mean, it turns out James Bulger could not have been more loved or more wanted, but Venables and Thompson didn't have any insight into that. Also, before they actually managed to abduct James, they had tried unsuccessfully to abduct another child and were charged and prosecuted for that. So what you're saying, that they knew that that child was loved and that child also bore a striking resemblance to their sibling? No, doesn't make any sense. What does play on our minds, mine, yours, anyone who's looked at this case, is what the hell happened in their lives to make them do what they did? Now, with regards to Venables, I'm going to be honest with you, I do wonder, was there some kind of sexual abuse in his past? Because he did have a very unhealthy interest in child pornography that we've seen him convicted for in more recent years, and also the potential sexual element of the crime towards James Bulger. Was something going on in his childhood, it could therefore link to the fact that when he had the opportunity to do something heinous to James, he did it because of some of the heinous actions that could have been happening to him. I don't know. I'm just putting it out there because of the links with him having this unhealthy interest in children now. It's irrelevant. He's a monster, whatever, isn't he? There's no way of dressing this up or dressing this down. He's a little beautiful boy who met his doom at the hands of 2 children who should have been climbing trees and wondering what they were going to get for Christmas. It's just impossible to be in the mindset that we see those children ending up in. For James's parents, I cannot even begin to imagine what they've been through over the years. It doesn't bear thinking about. To lose a child is the worst loss you can ever encounter, but to lose a child in such a horrific and public and brutal way is beyond every single parent's worst nightmare. Because what we know is that she adored and his father adored him. That was their child. And they had to live through the detailed accounts of James's final hours. They had to listen to the multitude of witnesses who saw him crying for his mum as he was led to his death. So many opportunities where he could have been saved. None of them taken. And to know that those final words that he spoke were to ask for his mum. For those poor parents, those loving parents, to know that the very place they would have chosen to be above everywhere or anywhere else would be by his side in his pain, to protect him, to save him from that brutal death, and to know that they couldn't, must be unbearable. You know, it's nearly 30 years on from that crime, but his mother still talks about James every day, and she's kept him in the light. She's kept people aware of the crime, the heinous nature. She's called people to account. She's fought hard. This is a woman who has refused to let James Bulger's name die out and be forgotten, because he has great meaning to her, and she wants him to have great meaning to all of us. She even sets a place for him at the Christmas table. It must be really difficult, because even though she remembers her beautiful angelic child as the beautiful boy that she was bringing up, she's also clearly aware that we remember him as a murder victim. So you don't think about the fact that he was this happy, carefree, loved, loving little boy full of hope. We see the end picture. We hear the consequence of that horrific day. And that must be frustrating for her too. Both Ralph and Denise did go on to marry again, and they have had children. In fact, James Bulger's mum, she has had 3 children, one of which she was pregnant with when James was taken. She's also met somebody new, got married and had 2 other boys. So in spite of her agony of loss, at least there is some comfort in knowing that the mother that she was born to be has been something that's played out in her life. Her ex-husband, he too has had a little girl, and that in itself doesn't take away any of the harshness of the pain, the agony at all. But at least it gives both parties a place to put all of the love that they had for their son into a child that is still physically here. And without doubt, both of those, in spite of the fact that they've separated and met new people and had families, they are both permanently scarred by the loss of James, without a doubt. Now, before I actually mentioned the doctrine of Doli Incapax, and I want to just tell you a little bit more about that. So that says that children of a certain age are considered incapable of committing crime. And when the law changed in 1998, this meant that children aged over 10 could no longer use this defence. It meant that we had the youngest age of criminal responsibility in Europe. And I'll tell you some examples. So in Sweden, for example, the age of criminal responsibility is 15. It's a big gap, isn't it? So this is an issue that still causes so much controversy. It divides so much opinion. And often there is moral outrage at some crimes, but even though that moral outrage feels justified, to some degree, I guess it has the power and potential to affect our judgment on the issue. I guess that Thompson and Venables are really a case in point. The fact that Thompson asked the police, for example, that could James be taken to the hospital to get him alive again, it does potentially suggest that he may not fully have understood the consequences of his actions. I mean, who knows? So I guess the question that we have to ask ourselves is 10 too young to be criminally responsible? Do you actually know that your actions are seriously wrong at that age? Should it, to some degree, be based solely on chronological maturity? Or should there be points where you look at emotional maturity as well, you take that into account? I'm only posing those questions because they're the questions that get posed. What I will say is I'm pretty sure that when I was 10 years of age, I knew absolutely what was right and what was wrong. And certainly I knew what was seriously wrong. For example, I knew it wasn't okay to hit another child. I knew it wasn't okay to hurt an animal. I knew it wasn't okay to steal. I knew it wasn't even okay to lie. Probably failed on that quite a lot, the lying bit. And I do remember I did steal a little bit from my dad sometimes. Sometimes he had loose change, and I don't know, I wanted a chocolate bar. I still feel bad for that now. But the point is, I knew it was wrong. So I am absolutely convinced, no matter how blurred their vision was about the implications of what they did that day, they knew it was seriously wrong to hurt a child, and without a doubt, they must have known it was seriously wrong to kill him. I mean, I would have definitely known that. So I can't even conceptualise that thought crossing a 10-year-old's mind, if I'm really honest, because it wouldn't have gone through mine at the time. Thompson has as well, from what I've read and researched, reported that he is truly remorseful for his actions, that he recognises the enormity of what he did, and he also acknowledges that it's really unfair because he had a better life and a better education because he murdered James. It's true. He was taken from a very bad place and put in a placement that helped him to thrive. And whilst I am a big believer in rehabilitation, it does seem tragically ironic that a murderer can have a better life because of their crimes, all the whilst the grieving family of the individual you have stole have to suffer for the rest of their lives. Again, I appreciate they were children when they did this. But for James Bulger's family, it's a lifelong sentence, isn't it? To some degree, no matter how beautiful their lives have become, it's still ruined in part by the loss that they endured. Having noted that, again, I will say I am glad that Thompson recognises what he did, the gravity of his crime, feels remorse for it, and is trying his best to adjust behaviour and live a pro-social life. But that's not going to bring any comfort at all to James Bulger's mum and dad. It really cut me up, this case. Maybe it's because I was impressed at the time. Maybe it's because I look at that little beautiful boy and I see my own children in his face. Maybe it's because I read the reports early on when I was working in my career and the inquiry itself, and I felt that there were so many failures. Maybe it's because it's never left the press and I've had that interaction to some degree, being in the same place as James Bulger's mum. She's appeared on This Morning and so on and so forth. But I cannot wrap my head around the fact that two 10-year-old boys didn't just kill a child. They systematically tortured, abused, murdered, and left him for dead to be run over by a train, then tried to get on with their lives. It's unbelievable to me that this case needs to be talked about at all. Please let me know your thoughts. I'm sure that some of you feel absolutely incensed that Thompson is living as a free person. I'm sure that some of you will feel glad that the system has worked in that response. I imagine many of you will feel that Venables should never see the light of day. And I would imagine you all feel the same compelled connection with the family of James Bulger, who never deserved that pain and should be having him sat at their Christmas table instead of an empty space which reminds them and keeps him in mind within the family. Nonetheless, this case played out. I'm sure a lot of you have got different views on it. Let me know, leave me a comment, give me a like, let me know your thoughts and feelings. Subscribe if you haven't. I release content on a Wednesday and a Sunday. And remember guys, as ever, when it comes down to this kind of child death, I know it's really hard to wrap your heads around it, but I just want to dedicate this video to James. He was an absolutely beautiful, beautiful boy, and one that should still be living happily today in the arms and love of his family. Take care, be safe.